Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Now, I want to share about a wonderful book from this attorney Sidney Powell, License to Lie, Exposing Corruption in the Department of Justice. This incredible week trying to understand all what was happening around the world and America. To all those who seek, hallow, and do justice. License to Lie. Exposing corruption in the Department of Justice is a disturbing, enlightening, and superbly presented account of one of the most dramatic and chilling examples of injustice in American judicial history. Writing with the skill of a novelist, the keen eye of a memoirist, and the passion of an early American pamphleteer, Powell takes readers on a journey through an institutional landscape created to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. She reveals a house of legal horrors characterized by sacrificing innocent men, concealing and altering evidence, ignoring the law, and constantly displaying an ego-driving desire to win at all costs. Her message resonates throughout the book. The greatest human ideal of justice is only as good as the character of those who administer it, existing only if it is guardians and devoted to integrity and fairness. Michael Adams, Ph.D., University Distinguished Teaching Associates, Professor of English, Interim Director James and Missioner Center of Writers, University of Texas, Austin. Forward. We Americans are extremely proud of our criminal justice system. We believe it to be the best and fairest in the world, and in many ways it is. We guarantee every criminal defendant an impartial judge, a fair jury, and a defense lawyer at public expense for the many who can't afford one. The prosecution must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt and must do so in a speedy public trial, and we have a variety of rules governing the collection and presentation of evidence, all designed to ensure that justice is done in every case, but the system only works if the participants follow the rules. Prosecutors have a particularly strong duty to act fairly because, as the Supreme Court has explained, they are representatives not of an ordinary party to a controversy, but of a sovereign whose obligation to govern impartially is as compelling as it is obligation to govern at all, and whose interest, therefore, in a criminal prosecution is not that it shall win a case, but that justice shall be done. In the words of fabled defense lawyers Brendan Sullivan, if the government is not honest, it can trump even the best efforts of those of us who work in the system. Sullivan uttered those words in the case against former Senator Ted Stevens, who was convicted after federal prosecutors concealed evidence favorable to the defense and lied about it in court. The conviction was vacated once the government's deception was revealed, but this occurred long after Stevens had lost an election, ending a 40-year Senate career and changing the balance of power in the Senate as a direct result of the wrongful conviction. The Stevens case is just one of the several high-profile criminal prosecutions engineered by a small cadre of high-ranking United States Department of Justice lawyers. Most of the convictions obtained by the government have been set aside, but not before wasting countless millions of taxpayers' dollars and wreaking havoc on the lives and business of those charged with federal crimes. The venerable accounting firm of Arthur Anderson was destroyed by a prosecutorial decision to charge the firm, not merely individual partners, with criminal conduct, while the Supreme Court eventually held that the crime of which Anderson was convicted was not crime at all. In other words, that Anderson had acted lawfully. The exoneration came too late to save the business or the 85,000 jobs it provided its various offices worldwide. Other defendants were exonerated after spending time behind bars for conduct that turned out to be entirely lawful. The Center for Prosecutor Integrity lists the following as some of the most serious types of prosecutorial misconduct: charging a suspect with more offense than is warranted, withholding or delaying the release of exculpatory evidence, deliberately mishandling, mistreating, or destroying evidence, allowing witnesses they know or should know are not truthful to testify, pressuring defense witnesses not to testify, relying on fraudulent forensic experts during plea negotiations, overstating the strength of the evidence, making statements to the media that are designed to arouse public indignation, making improper or misleading statements to the jury, failing to report prosecutors' misconduct when it is discovered. And why do prosecutors engage in misconduct? The Center provides an answer. Prosecutors are subjected to a variety of powerful incentives that serve to reward zealous advocacy, the gratitude of victims, favorable media coverage, career promotions, appointment to judgeships, and the allure of high political office. Much of this behavior is illustrated in the pages of this book and requires no elaboration. However, two items on the Center for Prosecutor Integrity lists merit in a few additional words, as their significance may not be immediately apparent to the readers unfamiliar with the criminal justice process. The first is the growing practice of overcharging, particularly with crimes of dubious validity. One of the bedrock principles of our criminal law is that citizens are entitled to fair notice of what is criminal and what's legal. People can then avoid prosecution by engaging in lawful activities. The right to do what the law does not prohibit without fear of harassment or punishment is one of the hallmarks of a free society. One of the fundamental responsibilities of a prosecutor is to charge defendants only with conduct that is clearly criminal. And yet, time and again in these high-profile prosecutions, the United States Department of Justice charged multiple defendants with crimes that simply weren't crimes. In addition to the so-called crime that destroyed Arthur Anderson, the Supreme Court held in rapid succession that the government had obtained convictions in 3 other cases where the charged conduct wasn't criminal. Nevertheless, the government insisted and the judge supinely agreed that the defendants must start serving their time behind bars even as their challenges to their conviction upon these alleged violations were being considered on appeal. Another important responsibility of prosecutors is to disclose the defense any exculpatory information of which the government is aware. The Supreme Court announced this a constitutional requirement in the 1963 case of Brady versus Maryland, and it has confirmed its underlying principles many times since. It may not be obvious to the lay reader why the government must provide a defendant with evidence that may undermine the prosecution, so it is worth a brief explanation. Most fundamental is the fact that the government is not an ordinary litigant whose interest lies in winning at all costs. Rather, the government's legitimate interest lies in convicting only those defendants who are proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. If the government has evidence that casts doubt on the defendant's guilt, it has every interest in producing that evidence for the jury to consider and reaching its decision. As the Supreme Court noted in the Brady, an inscription on the walls of the Department of Justice states the proposition candidly for the federal domain. The United States wins its points wherever justice is done, its sits in the courts. Beyond this theoretical justification are important practical reasons for the Brady's rule. Government agents usually have unimpeded and exclusive access to the crime scene, so they can easily remove and conceal evidence that might contradict the prosecution's case. Police also generally talk to witnesses first and can pressure them to change their story to conform to the prosecution's theory of the case. Prosecutors can, and often do, threaten to charge witnesses and accomplices or conspirators if they testify favorably to the defense. As a result, potential exculpatory witnesses invoke the Fifth Amendment to avoid getting themselves into trouble. The government has virtually unhampered control over forensic evidence, as well as its analysis and presentation by experts. Too often these experts turn out to be sloppy or dishonest. Many defendants have spent long years behind bars because of incompetent or corrupt forensic scientists employed by law enforcement. Many of those convictions could have been avoided if the jury had been shown the evidence, casting doubt on the validity of the expert reports. While no one openly disputes the validity of the Brady rule, many prosecutors see it as a thorn in their sides, an obstacle to overcome rather than a welcome responsibility to be scrupulously observed. Prosecutors want to win, for all the reasons mentioned by the Center for Prosecutor Integrity report above, and they see Brady as an impediment to obtaining a conviction. While there are certainly many honest and fair-minded prosecutors, a disturbing number failed to disclose exculpatory evidence to defense. Some prosecutors affirmatively and knowingly concealed it. There was such knowing concealment of exculpatory evidence in the case against Senator Stevens, and his conviction was vacated and the charge against him dismissed. But Senator Stevens was doubly lucky. First, an honest FBI agent broke ranks with his colleagues and the prosecutors in the Department of Justice and disclosed the government's willful Brady violations and lies to the district court. And second, M. Sullivan, the district judge presiding over the case, took the matter seriously and ordered an investigation of the lawyers who had conducted the prosecution. Deeply troubled that, again and again, the government was caught making false representations, a polite term for telling bald-faced lies, Judge Sullivan boasted. The United States government has an obligation to pursue conviction fairly and in accordance with the Constitution. And when the government does not meet its obligations to turn over evidence, the system falters. But what happened in Stevens' case is vanishingly rare. Brady violations are extremely difficult to discover because the prosecution has complete control over the evidence gathered by its investigators. Prosecutors know that if they fail to produce exculpatory evidence, no one is likely to find out. Even when the evidence is fortuitously disclosed after the defendant is convicted, judges are very reluctant to order a new trial. So they sweep the evidence under the rug, and immaterial or cumulative sanctions against prosecutors who violate Brady are practically unheard, and professional discipline is non-existent. As a consequence, there is, as I've said elsewhere, an epidemic of Brady violations abroad in the land. The author of this book is a former prosecutor turned private practitioner who represented the defendant in one of the high-profile cases discussed in the pages that follow. She was called in by the defense team after the client had been convicted. As she described her first meeting with the client and his lawyers, they were traumatized, exhausted, run out, meek and broken as a result of what had been a brutal trial. I seem to have more testosterone than all of them put together, she quips. In truth, Sidney Powell has more testosterone than pretty much any room full of lawyers, be they men or women. Writing a book like this more than proves it. Not only does she take on a by name prosecutors and former prosecutors who continue to serve in the powerful and responsible position, she is also relentless in criticizing judges before whom she practiced for years. Few lawyers have some stones to do this. Some of what Powell recounts, such as the concealment of evidence and lies told the court in the Stevens case, is in the public record and not subject to reasonable dispute. As to the other matters, she draws on her own experience. The trial record and evidence later uncovered to level serious accusations of malfeasance against the lawyers and judge involved in the high-profile criminal cases she discussed. Readers can make up their own minds as to whether those accusations are supported. It is hoped that those at whom she points the finger will answer the charges, one way or another. However, this book should serve as the beginning of a serious conversation about whether our criminal justice system continues to live up to its vowed reputation. As citizens of a free society, we all have an important stake in making sure that it does. Alex Kosinski. This is a wonderful book. Chapter 1, The Ultimate Toll. Sunday, September 26, 2010. It began as a typical autumn day in Washington, D.C. The trees were dressing in their finery, and the air was becoming crisper by the day. It was time for apples, sweatshirts, and football games. In a quiet northwest corner of the city, there was a mixed neighborhood of construction from the 1950s and older small bungalows. The bungalows were almost all refurbished, now unoccupied by young professionals working their way up through the gray bureaucracy we call our national government. Indeed, the brick and Cape Cod gray framed cottage on 8th Street Northwest was completely unremarkable to anyone on the outside until mid-afternoon. Nick was flopped on the sofa in the downstairs recreation room, watching the endless football games. Actually, he didn't even know what he was watching. It didn't matter anyone. Around 2 p.m., Nick got up and trudged to the laundry room where piles of clothes were lying on the floor. He found a loose razor blade and slashed his left wrist. Then he closed his eyes and slashed his right wrist. He opened his eyes and watched the blood run down his hands and onto the floor. He felt faint and nauseous, but he didn't think he had cut himself deeply enough to die, at least not quickly. He bled across the basement floor as he looked around for something else to use. He found a heavy-duty power cord, made a nose, and hung it himself. Not even that worked instantly. His neck did not snap. He was suffocating. When his wife came downstairs, she found Nick hanging by the power cord, unconscious and bleeding. She called 911, struggled to cut him down, and feverishly she administered CPR. Police cars, fire trucks, and an ambulance arrived at the house by 2:25 p.m. Nicholas Marsh, age 37, a prosecutor who had worked in the Elite Public Integrity section of the Criminal Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, lay on his basement floor in a pool of blood, a power cord around his neck. He was pronounced dead by the D.C. coroner at 2:30 p.m. He died of asphyxiation. 6 weeks earlier, in the great state of Alaska, a group of friends, several with their teenage children, boarded a red and white striped single-engine amphibious, the Havilland DHC-3, other airplane for the day of Alaska's finest fishing. It was August 9, 2010. The sky was gray with light rain in the morning, but the weather improved in the afternoon. A takeoff visibility was good, with some clouds and patches of blue sky. The friends had enjoyed a hearty lunch at the GCI Lodge on the Nerka Lake and were ready for an afternoon in the amazing Alaskan outdoors. Some already had on their hip waders. The plan took up about 3 p.m. for an early fishing camp. Former NASA Chief Sim O'Keefe and his son Kevin were on board. Young Kevin had the honor of sitting in the co-pilot seat where he went to sleep. He was already exhausted from this outdoor adventure with his dad and their friends. The prominent parents and teenagers in the cabin were busy talking about the day and the plans to bring more business to Alaska. A couple more dozen as the plane flew beneath in the clouds and above the barrier terrain, suddenly the plane banked to the left. Around 6 p.m., the folks at the lodge called the camp to find out when the group planned to return for dinner. The plane had never arrived. with full knowledge that Alaska is the most dangerous state for aircraft. They alerted all rescue services immediately. Other planes and helicopters were dispatched to look for the small plane. Severe weather was coming in fast. About 7:30 p.m., one of the volunteer searchers in the Cessna plane spotted the aircraft about 15 minutes from the lodge. The plane had crashed on a 30-degree slope of a heavily forested mountainside. An air helicopter crew arrived and they reported that the aircraft appeared mostly intact. There was no fire, but the left wing was turned off, leaving a gaping hole in the side of the fuselage that was visible from the air. The helicopter crew saw one survivor waving. The chauffeur landed about 1,000 feet above the accident site, dropped off technicians, and went to pick up a doctor. Shortly thereafter, the helicopter managed to drop off a doctor and then two emergency medical technicians with medical supplies and equipment. The small rescue team hiked down the mountain in the difficult conditions, carrying all they could before all Alaska night and weather closing in on them. When the rescuers reached the crash site, they found 5 people had died, including the pilot. Singh and Kefi, and 2 others were still alive. The rescue team spent the night helping the 4 survivors and trying to keep them warm. It took 12 hours for more rescuers to get to the site and evacuate everyone. The plane was equipped with a terrain awareness warning system that would have visually and audibly notified the pilot to pull up if he was too close to the terrain. The TOWs had been inhibited or disabled. There was no cockpit voice recorder or flight data recorded. 3 autopsies of the pilot provided no discernible reason for the crash. The breaking news on every channel hit Alaska and then the entire country like a aeonic earthquake. Former Senator Ted Stevens, beloved champion of Alaska, has been killed near Dillingham, Alaska in the crash of a private plane while he was on a fishing trip with longtime friends. Ted Stevens, a decorated World War II hero, a former U.S. attorney, and living legend in Alaska, had lost his seat of more than 40 years in the U.S. Senate after being found guilty by a jury a year early for failing to report alleged gifts on Senate forms. It turned out that Senator Stevens was innocent, and the prosecutors from the Public Integrity Section of the Department of Justice had broken ethical rules, disregarded court orders, and violated constitutional law while they hid evidence favorable to his defense called Brady material. The defense had caught on a few of these shenanigans, enough that U.S. District Judge M. Sullivan had become irate. The judge's refusal to ignore or excuse the prosecutor's misconduct deal with a whooping black eye to the Department of Justice in the media. When it became obvious that Judge Sullivan was going to dismiss the indictment against Stevens, Attorney General Eric Holder swooped in, proclaimed he would clean up the department, and moved to dismiss the indictment against Stevens. Holder's pledge, however, was too little and too late for the Judge Sullivan. Holder's proclamation notwithstanding, Judge Sullivan could no longer trust the Department of Justice. The light prosecutors had lied to him time and time again, often with deputy assistants, Attorney General Rita Glavin, Acting Attorney General Matthew Fredericks, eyes and ears observing in the courtroom. Judge Sullivan took the extraordinary step of appointment as special prosecutors, D.C. Attorney Henry Schwelke III, to investigate the prosecutors for possible charges including contempt. This was unprecedented. Former Senator Stevens, a vigorous and powerful advocate long beloved in Alaska, had publicly pledged to advocate tirelessly for new legislation that would require the government to produce Brady and information to a defendant in every case and to impose clear penalties for any failure to do so. Stevens didn't want what had happened to him to happen to anyone else. Remarkable, the Department of Justice vehemently opposed Stevens' proposal. The news of the senator's untimely death brought attention once again to his corrupt prosecution and dominant the news for the next several days. Editorials abounded, virtually all of which exalted former Senator Stevens' accomplishments on behalf of Alaska, and they all mentioned the injustice of his prosecution and the misconduct of his prosecutors. Stevens' defense attorneys, led by Brendan Sullivan and Rob Kerry of Williams and Connolly, lauded the senator's accomplishment and mourned the toll the corrupt prosecution had taken on him, his career, and his family. The verdict against him was based on fabricated evidence. Brendan Sullivan reminding everyone, Notable Judge Sullivan had appointed Schuelke, whose investigation into the misconduct of the prosecutors was ongoing, fallout from the case that devastated the reputation of the Justice Department's Public Integrity Section. Stevens was innocent and insisted on fighting the charges. The partners declared he remained profoundly affected by the government's misconduct and its implication for others. His fervent hope was that meaningful change would be brought to the criminal justice system so that others would not be mistreated, as he was by the very official whose duty is to represent the United States justly and fairly. The senator's death and the tsunami of renewed publicity of prosecutorial and government misconduct was drowning to Nick Marsh. He could hardly breathe. It was all he could do to get up in the morning and go to the back office to which he had been relegated at the Department of Justice. Nick felt heavier and heavier. He was on the verge of losing his career and possibly his liberty, and he felt as if he had lost his soul. He didn't recognize himself anymore. He needed peace, but he knew it would only get worse for him. At age 35, the handsome, angular-jawed, dark-haired young prosecutor had been one of the youngest attorneys in the prestigious Public Integrity Section of the Justice Department. Nicknamed Ping, his office was in Main Justice, the impressive building that occupies a block of expensive real estate between Pennsylvania and Constitution Avenues. He was just a couple of blocks from the White House and next door to the National Archives, which houses the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. In the 4-year Marsh had been federal prosecutor in the Ping. He had led the investigation into public corruption in Alaska. He and his team of fellow Ping prosecutor Edward Sullivan and Alaska assistants, U.S. Attorney Joseph W. Bottini and James A. Joik, along with FBI agents, had begun the Polar Pain investigation in Alaska in 2004. They had tried and convicted 7 high-profile legislators and businessmen, using much of the same evidence that they later used to indict and convict Senator Ted Stevens. Ping attorneys were the best of the best. They were supposed to adhere to the highest standards. After all, they investigated public officials for public corruption. They had to be above reproach. At the same time, there was so much pressure to win, especially in the high-profile and political prosecutions. These were the cases that would make or break prosecutors' career. A win in these cases was a first-class ticket to 7-figure incomes in the most prestigious national or international law firms or promotions, up the ladder in the Department of Justice, the White House, or the leadership of the FBI. The pressure had been had enough 2.5 years ago, before Matthew Frederick had skyrocketed from his position as the Enron Task Force prosecutors to acting Assistant Attorney General of the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice. Within days of the arrival of Frederick and his deputy, Rita Glavin, they introduced heavily into the Stevens case. They began weekly, sometimes daily meetings with Ping Management, Section Chief Bill Welch and Deputy Chief Brenda Morris. Frederick and Glavin demanded a chart of evidence and defenses, and they summoned all the prosecutors, including the 2 assistant U.S. attorneys from Alaska, from a presentation to them. For unknown reasons, they rushed to indict Senator Stevens, the longest-serving Republican in the Senate. Frederick and Glavin took control of the Stevens prosecution and micromanaged it to absurd detail. On the eve of indictment, they demoted Marsh from first chair to third chair for the Stevens trial, after Frederick and Glevin took over. The prosecution had nothing but problems, yet no one outside of the small cycle within the department would know that until long after it all started to unravel. Nick knew the truth. When it all fell apart, he and his fellow trial team members became the targets of both an internal department investigation and independent Schuelke investigation ordered by Judge Sullivan. Nick just knew that the life he loved as a federal prosecutor was over. He feared that everything that went wrong in the Stevens prosecution was going to be hung around his neck. Frederick and Glevin were way too politically connected and saved it to the detective fall. The judge did not name them in his order authorizing Schuelke's investigation. There was no apparent reason to do so. They were not the trial attorneys. Nick came to realize that being a target of a criminal investigation felt very different from running a bank. The Schuelke and internal investigation seemed to be taking forever. It had already been more than a year, 6 weeks after Senator Stevens' plane crashed, and that Nick was numb. The gruesome suicide of the Senator Stevens prosecutor, who was himself under investigation for corruption, dishonesty, and misconduct, sent another shock wave of distress through the department less than 2 months after the senator's plane crash. Yet again, the department and the wrongful prosecution of Stevens were in the national news. Virtually everyone who saw the breaking news and knew anything about the Stevens prosecution and investigation of the prosecutors viewed it as a message. Nicholas Marsh was guilty of hiding evidence that would have exonerated Senator Stevens or knew more than he said. Patton Box attorney Robert Luskin was Marsh's lawyer. Luskin spoke to reporters shortly after the news broke, calling Nick's suicide a terrible tragedy. He spoke of how Nick loved being a prosecutor, but was incredibly fearful that the investigation would end his career with the Justice Department. Luskin claimed they were on the verge of a successful resolution. He said he expected Schuelke to exonerate Marsh. Luskin optimist proclamation was far from the reality. Nicholas Marsh had felt that insider knew. Maybe Nick's friends and family believed it. Maybe they had to believe it. Maybe it was the only way they could protect their own feelings, or the Nick they believed him to be the Nick they thought they knew, the Nick they had always loved. Public Nick's friends and Luskin blamed the pressure and the length of the investigation for his suicide. Luskin added, the whole process imposed an unbelievable burden on Nick, a burden that in the end he couldn't bear. The Wall Street Journal reported that Joshua Berman, a former prosecutor and friend, said that Nick was anxious that he proved had dragged on, but friends never realized the depth of his worry. Berman said that the delay exacerbated Nick's stress and believed that the result would be something bad. No one ever seemed to consider the stress the wonderful prosecution had put on Senator Stevens and his family for substantially longer than 18 months, and the continuing effect it had on the remainder of his life and on his family. Lawyers in the defense bar saw Marsh's suicide as admission of his own guilt. Lawyers know all too well that prosecutors are almost never punished in any way, regardless of how egregious their conduct is. It's extremely difficult for a wronged defendant to sue a prosecutor. They have immunity from lawsuits because they work on behalf of the sovereign. They can hide evidence of a defendant's innocence with impunity. They have little concern that it will ever be discovered. And even if it is, they know they will suffer no consequences. Judge Rottner believed prosecutors when they saw we will produce a variety of evidence. Judges rarely push back on that assertion, no matter how much the defense complains or what suspicions are raised. Only on the rarest of occasions have prosecutors even been suspended by their bar association for hiding evidence favorable to the defense. And here, Marsh and each of his fellow prosecutors had the luxury of being represented at the taxpayer expense by the best criminal defense lawyers in the country. Ironically, Schwelke's investigation was moving quickly by federal standards. Many people, especially those prosecuted by Acting Attorney General Frederick and his colleagues, where they were on the Enron task force, lived with the torment of investigation, criminal charges, repeated prosecution, and imprisonment for years. Even a decade, no one in the department, including Marshall, gave any thought to the tall data tactics and decisions took on there until, perhaps, Judge Sullivan turned the tables. Being investigated was very different from being the investigator. It was as different as being on opposite ends of high-powered rifle with a laser sight. The news report that afternoon of September 26 and even the headlines the next morning all said almost the same things, not much. Government prosecutors in the Ted Stevens case commit suicide. They all quoted Robert Luskin's charitable assertion that Marsh would be exonerated by the investigations. Most quoted Assistant Attorney General Lanny Breuer's expression of sympathy at the loss of this dedicated young attorney on behalf of the community of the Department of Justice. Some quoted Marsh's friends. No details were provided from any office investigating the unusual death. The report seemed canned, and the story faded quickly. Nicholas Marsh and brilliant, capable young men paid the ultimate price for something that should never have happened. He was shattered by his own choices and those imposed upon him. Either way, he, Senator Stevens, and their family were needlessly sacrificed on opposite sides of the altar of injustice because of the deplorable failure of a system that is supposed to protect all of us. Before and after the Senator's death and Marshall's suicide, Special Prosecutors Schwelke and his partner, William Shields, were working diligently to pull back the cobalt blue curtain bearing the impressive seal of the Department of Justice. Ultimately, Schwelke would reveal shocking facts with ramifications of their own. As true as Schwelke was, he was barely scraping the surface. The illegal and unethical tactics that unseated Senator Stevens changed the balance of power in the Senate, and had now claimed two lies were orchestrated about Nicholas Marsh. Narcissists and terrifying tacticians were ascending to great power and foundation of a legacy of lies, corruption, and injustice that would take years to uncover. They had long practiced to win at any cost and skillfully avoided the true deep. Wow. This book is astounding and very powerful. You must understand. Everybody must read this book from the author, attorney, Sidney Powell. Hopefully, we're gonna still reading more. Bye-bye. Have a blessed day.